Hello, I'm Dr. Barry Monk, a consultant dermatologist. Why Can't We Learn from Our Mistakes is the title of a lecture that I gave at the Royal College of Physicians in 2023. It caused quite a lot of interest, and I thought it might be worth just revisiting the subject. I spent my entire professional life in the NHS and had already planned to retire in January 2020 when COVID came along. As I sat in enforced idleness, I spent some time reflecting on my years in the NHS. I remain immensely proud of having played my small part in such an organisation, and am constantly astonished by its remarkable achievements. Even in these challenging times, investigations and treatments which we now regard as routine were undreamed of just a few years ago. But what dispirited me is that you cannot pick up a newspaper without reading a story about some calamity or another. Clearly, editors find it more interesting to write about the bad than the good, but bad things happen far too often. I started writing a book, Lifeline, about this darker side of the NHS, and it forms the basis of this lecture. Some of what I'll tell you may seem improbable, but Lifeline contains all the sources and much more. As I collected information, a theme emerged. It seems all too often when something goes wrong in the NHS, there are attempts to ignore it, or brush it under the carpet, or to blame some inconvenient junior doctor, as with Dr. Bauer-Garber. And this inevitably results in the same mistakes and disasters repeating themselves. Indeed, when on the TV news you hear some hospital manager or medical director or politician gravely announcing lessons must be learned, you know instinctively that they won't. And of course, when things go horrifically wrong, the Minister of Health can call a public inquiry. Politically, this is a masterstroke because the average tenure of a Minister of Health is 2 years, and these types of inquiries typically take many, many years, and their conclusions can be then quietly ignored. The Hillsborough inquiry took 27 years. Bloody Sunday took 40. One wonders how long the COVID inquiry will take. Will any of us still be around? One thing that did strike me was that there are other large organisations in Britain, aviation, the railways, the nuclear industry, which for many years had catastrophic safety records and which, as in the NHS, were all too often brushed under the carpet. However, unlike the NHS, in each of these cases there was a critical point when, almost like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, there was a moment of revelation and everything changed. Take aviation. The Royal Flying Corps, the precursor of the RAF, was formed in 1912. In those days, aircraft were pretty rudimentary, of course. Within weeks, the RFC had had its first fatal crash. The station commander issued an instruction: flying will resume as normal after tea. And thus a tradition was formed. The modern era of aviation began in the 1950s with the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet-engined civil aviation plane. The government were immensely proud of this British world beater, but it had one unfortunate problem in that the Comet crashed with monotonous regularity. The authorities attributed each crash to pilot error and carried on. The chief test pilot of de Havilland, John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, a Second World War flying ace, said that the new breed of pilots were just not up to the job. A bit like blaming the junior doctors. Only when numbers started stacking up did the chief engineer, Barnes Wallis, the man who had designed the bouncing bomb in the Second World War, pointed out that each of the crashes was absolutely identical and that the comet had a fundamental design fault. The square windows could not resist the pressure changes at altitude and blew out. The comet was grounded, but crashes of other airplanes and for other reasons continued with frightening regularity. The gung-ho attitude of the industry prevailed. Until Kegworth in January 1989. A British Midlands plane en route from London to Belfast attempted an emergency landing at East Midlands, but crashed into the embankment of the M1 motorway. This crash took place a few weeks after the Lockerbie disaster. Lockerbie wasn't an accident, it was mass murder, but Kegworth happening so soon afterwards shocked the aviation industry and triggered a dramatic change of mindset. The result was that almost overnight, the British aviation put safety into a paramount position, and the results have been a safety record unsurpassed anywhere in the world. The same could be said of the railways and the nuclear industry, both of which had appalling disregard to safety until a moment of revelation changed things. Sadly, the NHS hadn't had its moment. Medical disasters are, of course, about real people, and I'm going to tell you the story of Joshua Titcomb, who died needlessly, aged 9 days. It's a very sad and harrowing story. It'll make you very cross. Joshua's mum had had 2 previous normal deliveries. When her waters broke, she phoned the maternity unit at her local hospital and was told to stay at home until she was in established labour. So, as instructed, she stayed at home for several days, went into labour, was admitted, and had an apparently normal delivery. A few hours later, however, she collapsed with a severe abdominal pain and a high fever. She had that old-fashioned diagnosis of puerperal sepsis and was resuscitated with fluids and antibiotics. The parents asked if Joshua might have an infection as well, but were reassured. Next day, Joshua didn't seem right to the parents, but again they were reassured. In fact, he was hypothermic, a feature of sepsis in neonates. The following day, he was clearly very unwell and was transferred to the regional neonatal ITU, where he died. After Joshua's death, the distraught Titcombs sought some explanation, but were initially told it was just an unfortunate occurrence and a one-off. Joshua's father, James Titcomb, was a man with a different mindset. He was in fact a safety engineer at a nuclear power station, and he began asking questions. Mysteriously, within a month of Joshua's death, the care records for his admission had disappeared, never to be found. But it was clear that that was not a one-off. The convenient disappearance of documents wasn't unique to Joshua's case. The inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire also found that all the documents relating to the fitting of cladding had disappeared, and of course neither Boris nor Rishi can find their WhatsApp messages from COVID. Joshua's father received a letter from the hospital asking him to stop asking awkward questions. In fact, at Furness, there had been a string of catastrophes and near misses on the maternity unit dating back to at least 2004. And in 2008, one of the consultant obstetricians had written to the medical director of the hospital trust expressing his concerns. He warned that further tragedies would occur unless remedial action was taken. There was no response to the letter, and no action appeared to follow. At around this time, the trust was applying for foundation trust status, and the maternity unit was subject to an unannounced inspection by the CQC. It was duly given a clean bill of health, and the regulatory body Monitor awarded the hospital group foundation trust status in October 2010. Immediately after the CQC visit, Joshua's father wrote to Andrew Lansley, the Secretary of State for Health, urging him to look at the hospital and warning him that other lives were at risk. He received no reply from the minister, who instead instructed an official at the Department of Health's Customer Services Centre to inform Mr. Titcombe that he was unable to comment. So a grieving parent is now called a customer. Whoever knew that? In 2011, an inquest was finally held into Joshua's death. The coroner determined that Joshua had died of pneumococcal infection, the same organism that had affected his mother, and that there was an 80% chance that the timely administration of antibiotics would have saved him. The coroner was highly critical of the hospital and concerned about the apparent collusion of the 11 midwives who gave evidence. Cumbria Police started an investigation into several deaths on the maternity unit. In the event, they passed the matter to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the NMC. They didn't take any action for 2 years, and the last hearings into those involved in Joshua's care only took place in 2017, 8 years after his death. Some of the midwives who were struck off had in fact been working on the midwifery unit for those 8 years, and in some cases were involved in subsequent serious incidents involving avoidable harm and death. And at the same time, the NMC spent £240,000 on legal fees trying to withhold information from Joshua's father. It gets worse. In May 2011, the BBC broadcast a panorama documentary about the systematic abuse of patients in Winterbourne View, a care facility for young adults with severe learning disabilities and autism. Several of the staff were convicted of assaulting patients. The CQC had ignored pleas from a senior nurse at Winterbourne View to take action. The chief executive of the CQC resigned, and her successor ordered an independent inquiry into the organisation. Evidence was received from a whistleblower within the CQC that the 2010 report into the maternity service at Furness had been doctored so as not to show the hospital in a bad light, which would have impeded the Trust's application for foundation status. The new chairman of the CQC admitted that the organisation was not fit for purpose. This is the body that is supposed to protect patients and ensure safe care. In 2013, Jeremy Hunt, who by this time was the Health Secretary, ordered a full independent inquiry into the deaths on the maternity unit at Furness. The report was published in 2015 and revealed a trail of catastrophe with avoidable deaths of mothers and babies and others surviving with severe handicap. The report criticised the wider NHS for the way it had monitored and regulated the hospital, or rather had failed to regulate and monitor it. There had been, the report stated, simultaneous failures of a great many systems at almost every level, from labour ward to headquarters of national bodies. Perhaps even more concerning was the report's ominous suggestion that there was no reason to suppose that events at Furness were unique. Indeed, this dire prediction was to come true as stories of catastrophe on an even larger scale have emerged from Shropshire, East Kent, Nottingham, Essex, and North Devon, and elsewhere. In each case, the story is not merely of catastrophic failure, but of ostrich-like denial. At Furness alone, compensation in 37 cases came to £45 million. But quite apart from the financial costs, each case of unnecessary death and avoidable harm is a tragedy for the whole family, with the death of a mother or a newborn baby or a child with lifelong handicap through brain injury. And the suffering of the families is further aggravated by the time it takes for compensation claims to be settled. The largest claim at Furness, relating to a child born with catastrophic brain damage and requiring constant lifelong care, took 12 years of litigation. The effect on the family of having to care for a child and battle through the courts must have been unimaginable. Yet nothing seemed to have been learned, as in 2023, a CQC report into maternity at Furness rated the service as inadequate. In short, nothing has been learned, and the truth only came out through the extraordinary tenacity of Joshua's father. It shouldn't be like that. This is Dr. Zolia Alemi, who had worked in the NHS as a consultant psychiatrist for 23 years, working in numerous different hospitals around the country. In 2018, she found herself in the dock at Carlisle Crown Court, charged with having attempted to defraud a wealthy elderly patient with dementia by forging her will. The amount of money in question was £1.3 million. Sitting in the press benches was a local journalist, Phil Coleman. Phil is a master of old-fashioned reporting. Something told him that things weren't right, and he began to doing some investigation of his own. He checked the medical register, and that Dr. Alemi had been registered by the GMC in 1995 with qualifications from Auckland University Medical School in New Zealand. He phoned New Zealand and spoke with the medical school. Yes, Zolia Alemi had been a student, but she had failed her exams and never qualified as a doctor. The New Zealand Medical Council confirmed that she had never qualified. Only after Phil Coleman's revelation did the GMC check and found that she'd been registered with a diploma which was a blatant homemade forgery, complete with spelling mistakes. Alemi had been through 10 appraisals and 2 cycles of revalidation. Complaints about her had been made to the GMC on 9 occasions, and not once had the GMC had trouble to check whether she was a real doctor. At one stage, she'd been a responsible officer, sitting in judgment on whether others could continue to practice. It had taken Phil Coleman 2 phone calls and 30 minutes to expose the truth. And thanks to the GMC, for 23 years, she'd been admitting patients under section, prescribing powerful psychotropic drugs, sitting on mental health tribunals, and administering ECT without any medical qualifications. Or to use the words of the Glasgow Herald, this bogus doctor had been allowed to fry people's brains with 400 volts. Alemi was sent to prison for 5 years and was subsequently sentenced to a further 7 years for having defrauded the NHS by claiming a salary as a doctor for 23 years. The trial judge called for an urgent inquiry into the GMC. There has been no such inquiry. Even worse, there has still been no systematic effort to establish what harm Alemi did to the thousands of patients who she would have treated. 5 years on, no one has even begun that task. And are there other Zolia Alemis? Almost certainly, because the GMC system for registration is wide open to abuse. The GMC themselves have admitted that they do not have the technical ability to validate diplomas from abroad, and they outsource this to a private company in the United States. How many of you knew that? And what of appraisal and revalidation? It certainly hadn't proved to be any obstacle to Dr. Alamy. This was a system introduced by the GMC in the light of the Harold Shipman case. Shipman is thought to have murdered some 280 patients. After his conviction in 2000 of 15 counts of murder, an inquiry was established under Dame Janet Smith. The GMC, suspecting correctly that they were going to be heavily criticised in Dame Janet's report, hastily established appraisal and revalidation. As the Dr. Alamy case shows, revalidation doesn't seem to have been effective in its purpose. Should anyone be surprised? Remarkably, the person who the GMC put in charge of revalidation, the process which was supposed to protect the public, was a lady called Lindsay Westwood, who had no prior experience of working in healthcare and whose previous job had been to be appeals manager at the Traffic Penalty Tribunal. As one member of the medical profession wrote at the time, the person who the GMC put in charge of checking the fitness to practice of every doctor in Britain was recently checking parking tickets for a living. I may add that at the time of speaking to you, she is still there. But it's even worse than that. Shipman would and should have been prevented had the GMC not been asleep on the job over 20 years earlier. In 1975, Shipman, then a young GP, was admitted to the Priory Psychiatric Hospital in York for 6 months to treat his opiate addiction. He had been stealing drugs and altering prescriptions at the surgery where he was working, and in 1976 appeared at Halifax Magistrates Court and admitted 8 drug offences and asked for a further 74 to be taken into consideration. As with any doctor who had been convicted of a criminal offence, he duly appeared before the GMC. The GMC called the policeman who had investigated and arrested Shipman, Detective Sergeant George McKeating of the West Yorkshire Drug Squad, to the hearing, but in the event they didn't decide to call him to give evidence. McKeating is on record as having said that had he been called, he would have advised the GMC that Shipman was manipulative, devious, and totally untrustworthy. In the event, the GMC put no restrictions on his practice, and Shipman went on to work in a single-handed practice where he had unsupervised access to the dangerous drugs register and was allowed unfettered to murder at will. But Shipman would never have been able to do what he did if the GMC hadn't failed in an earlier case, that of Dr. Bodkin Adams, a GP in Eastbourne. Adams is thought to have killed about 140 of his patients, usually shortly after they'd made him the beneficiary of their will. In 1957, he was found not guilty of murder at a famous trial at the Old Bailey, but subsequently called before the GMC. The GMC struck him off for the heinous offence of selling NHS elasticated stockings to private patients. But what they'd failed to do was to take any action about GPs, and especially single-handed GPs, such as Adams and subsequently Shipman, of whom there were many at the time, administering dangerous drugs without any checks on their record keeping. This was commonplace and was exactly the loophole which Shipman was to exploit with such deadly effect. So we have these three, Alamy, Shipman, and Adams, three of the most systematically wicked characters in the NHS. Each was exposed through a patient's will, but each was allowed to get away with things through the grotesque failings of the GMC. And this is the GMC, which so evidently fails its public duty to protect the public, which now wishes to expand its realm, not just to regulate doctors, but apparently physicians' associate and other newfangled creations. So who is going to protect the patients? Self-evidently not the GMC or the NMC. The CQC has admitted that it's not fit for purpose. Senior managers, politicians, I think not. There is only one group of people who can and must protect the patients, and it is us, the doctors. Well, my time is up, but if you do find this subject of interest, do please go online to Amazon or Waterstones and get a copy of Lifeline and tell other people to read it as well. There's a lot more information. I cover all sorts of other stories, all sorts of other mischief. And if you disagree with me or want to shout at me, please send a message to my email address, barrymonk@doctors.org.uk. I hope you've enjoyed this talk.